Welcome to our second RPP Forum, the place to come for all things about getting started and working in research practice partnerships. We will hear from educators and researchers around the United States about the successes, challenges, and strategies for overcoming them when we get together to solve our most pressing educational problems. It's November 19th, and we're here for our second forum. Our topic today is defining the focus of partnership work. We're going to have a conversation about how partners figure out what problems of practice to tackle in their work together. I'm Bill Penuel from the University of Colorado School of Education, and I'm facilitating this forum discussion with support from the research practice Collaboratory, a project funded by the National Science Foundation. I'm excited to welcome our invited panelists who bring a range of backgrounds and expertise in research practice partnerships. You can find this and all future forum conversations archived at bit.ly/RPP forum. For today's forum, we invite you to participate too on Twitter using the hashtag RPPchat to share ideas that you find interesting and also to pose questions to the panelists. Annie Allen from our team is going to be monitoring Twitter during the forum and will feed me questions from the audience. So I'm going to introduce partners by name and their institutional affiliation and tell you all a little bit about their partnership work. So Ananda Marin from Northwestern University and Jasmine Gurneau from the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative are part of the Living in Relationships Partnership. And this partnership is a long-standing partnership among researchers and Native American communities in the Chicagoland area. Their joint work is restoring sovereignty to Native peoples over young people's education and encompasses issues such as land restoration, language loss awareness, food sovereignty, indigenous games, digital literacy, and representational issues in the media and beyond. The partnership engages in community-based design research and has thought deeply about not only how to engage youth in rebuilding relations with all our living relatives, but also about how to structure partnerships in ways that foreground addressing historical inequities. From the California Tinkering After School Network, we have Ryoo of the Exploratorium and Emily McLeod of Techbridge. And CTAN brings together expertise from after-school directors, facilitators, and researchers across the Community Science Workshop Network in Fresno and Watsonville, Discovery Cube of Santa Ana, the Exploratorium of San Francisco, and Techbridge in Oakland. The network works to design for, implement, and study teaching and learning in science, technology, and math-rich after-school tinkering programs that serve youth from low-income, historically marginalized communities. This group's also engaged in thoughtful work about how to promote equitable facilitation of making and tinkering after-school activities. From the Houston Education Research Consortium, we have Ruth López Turley of Rice University and Carla Stevens from the Houston Independent School District. And HIRC is a great example of a research alliance between university researchers and a school district focused on research projects of interest to the district. Among other things, their work is focused on identifying when kids are off track for graduation, assessing a program designed to support struggling readers, and identifying the most effective bilingual education model for English language learners. Ruth also helped to launch the National Education Research Practice Partnership, or NERP, a new network of research practice partnerships nationwide. Welcome to you both. And from Seattle-Renton University of Washington Partnership, we have Dan Gallagher from Seattle Public Schools. Phil Bell from the University of Washington was supposed to join us today, but is not feeling well and can't be here. This partnership brings together researchers from the University of Washington's Institute for Science and Math Education and district leaders and teachers from the Seattle and Renton school districts as they implement the next generation science standards. We're excited to have Dan, not only because of their partnership as part of the Research Practice Collaboratory, but also because both of them have been leading workshops in how to organize the joint work of partnerships. And currently they're involved in multiple lines of work to support implementation of next-gen science standards. So welcome to each and all of you. And for this first two questions that I'm going to ask, we're just going to go round robin, and I'll cue the partners to talk in the order that I just introduced you, and give each of the partnerships a chance to answer the question. And so we'll start with a living in relationships. And the first question for today is, how did your partnership decide on what to focus on in your work together? What was the initial kind of topic or goal or problem that brought the partners together initially? So Ananda and Jasmine?
Thank you for that introduction. Our goal has always been and continues to be educational self-determination and reclaiming and uncovering our best pedagogical practices and really thinking about how to gain autonomy to work through the intergenerational trauma that has defined our experience with formal education as Indigenous peoples, and looking at, you know, ways of knowing and being, and for us that was in the context of science teaching and learning broadly conceived. Oh, you want to try?
Sure. And then I think in terms of narrowing our focus, that was really done in design circles, and they took a similar shape as what we think of as talking circles, so that everyone's voice was heard and everyone had a role. Initially, these started as larger community design circles, and over time they narrowed as people took on different roles throughout the projects, and then they would expand again and narrow back in, and that was really the format that we used to decide the content focus of what we were doing.
And those design spaces were always constantly renegotiating what that focus was.
And how did that what did that renegotiation look like as it unfolded? Just give one example, perhaps, of something that shifted as you started one place and had to shift.
So one thing that shifted was the location of our work. In the very beginning of our project, we had lots of debates about where we would implement what we were thinking about then as outdoor science lessons, and in some ways we had taken, I think, kind of a field trip approach, and one of the elders in the community really pushed us to start with the American Indian Center as our home base. So the garden really became our classroom. There's a garden outside of the American Indian Center, and that became our classroom. And over time, the places of where we implemented were renegotiated, and we expanded from the American Indian Center out to local forest preserves. But I really remember this one elder being pretty adamant about us starting at the American Indian Center, and she helped us to kind of reframe how we were thinking about things as our home base.
And why there, if I might ask? You said the elder was kind of adamant about starting there. Why was that base important?
Were you going to say something? I think it also went. I think that also speaks to kind of this tension that we had when we first were designing things. And it was very easy to go out and look for other models, or to look for something that was already done and then overlay some Indigenous perspective over it. And I think she was really trying to push us to create something that was our own and to start in the community. And then if we wanted to go and explore other things, that would be okay, but I think she really wanted us to center things in our own traditions and our own ways of knowing.
Great. Let's hear from Emily and Jean. How did you guys get started? How did you figure out where to start in your work?
So in our, I'll backtrack a little bit and give some history. The partners in our collaboration had about 3 years ago come together around their interests in tinkering and informal contexts and after-school contexts, and shared video of practice and kind of thinking about what was important in the work that everyone was doing in their different after-school spaces, which are all very different from each other in our network. And people enjoyed that so much that Bronwyn Bevan, who was at the Exploratorium, sent in a grant proposal to Bechtel requesting funding to continue that work together. And then she also got funding with you, Bill, in the Research Practice Collaboratory to support research practice partnerships. And so kind of marrying those two efforts, we came together as a network again, and called it the California Tinkering After School Network. And that original proposal had a set of questions that were posed as common areas of interest among the network partners around, you know, what does learning look like through tinkering and making in after-school contexts? What sort of supports are necessary for facilitators and educators to really help students learn STEM through tinkering and making? And then also, what are the issues of sustainability and scale that arise in after-school programming? And so we had these kinds of questions that we knew were interesting to the group, but as a research practice partnership, it wasn't really clear how people understood those questions, what were the values people had around each of those three topics, and also for each site, what specifically people wanted to zoom in on through the research.
So we came together at the beginning of this iteration of our partnership and participated in a tool called value mapping, and we actually, Gina's just published on the Collaboratory website. Handy dandy resource if you're interested in trying it out yourself. And what value mapping did was allow us to come together as a network, all of the partners at the table, really look at those initial focuses for the research questions, and it gave each of the partners a chance to highlight what among those questions was most important for them, how they defined those terms that we were talking about, and then you know, at the end we sort of whittled it down and said, okay, these are the important key questions that we want to explore or ask together. So that tool was really a critical part of how we formed what the questions were that we were going to pursue. Do you want to share? I
actually brought the original value map that we drew together on. So this is kind of messy looking, but these were some of the, for example, when we were thinking about practice and tinkering and after school, people shared ideas like, you know, that it should be learner driven and that kids should have exposure to something new and using frustration as a tool for learning. And then you see these places where there are notes or things are circled where the items, after we shared all of our values around these ideas, people would circle the ones that were most important to them after doing like a gallery walk of the posters. And that's how we began to figure out the focus of the Research Practice Partnership.
And how did you get to specific activities from those shared values or the values that you prioritized?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, so how did you get to doing some specific work from the values that you articulated?
I guess part of it was, and sorry if I'm not understanding your question right, but part of it was the value map helped us in terms of when we did the research, which was mainly ethnographic, in terms of when we went into the space, what to kind of keep an eye on that our partners were really interested in knowing more about or focusing on. Mm-hmm. So trying to keep note of that, but then also being open to the things that might be more than that that was also on the value map. And then this tool has also been useful in terms of revisiting the research questions partway into the partnership, and also they helped us think about our coding scheme in this current period. We're doing data analysis of observation, field notes, and interviews and such. And so while a lot of the codes are grounded in what we're seeing in the field notes, some of them are aligning in really beautiful ways with the initial values that people shared. So that's kind of how it's impacted the activities of the research. And I don't know if in terms of like practice, I think it has impacted in terms of also like that we've been trying to create resources.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Part of the work that our network has ended up doing, in part, I think because of the values we identified during that process, has been a series of tools to help, with facilitation and tinkering, particularly around how to increase equity when you're doing those kinds of activities. And I think that work has stemmed in large part because that was something that really surfaced as an interest of all of the different network partners when we began.
Great, thanks. Let's hear from Carla and Ruth in Houston. How did your work get started with the Houston Education Research Consortium when you first started out?
Sure, maybe I'll get started and then I'll let Carla fill in, especially from the district's perspective. But this partnership did not start based on a particular project or a particular research question, but rather it started because of a mutual interest to try to improve the connection between academic research and district decision making, and then I'll just say from my perspective, I was really just to put it simply, rather frustrated with the general way that I saw academic research, to put it bluntly, not doing a really good job of informing practitioners and education decision makers because of the way that many education or many academic researchers focus on, publishing in particular academic outlets that really aim to inform other researchers, which is obviously very useful, but if that's where it ends, then I don't think it's doing all that it can or should be doing. So from my perspective, this partnership was of interest because it gave me an opportunity to work directly with the potential users of research, and it honestly just made me feel like my research was a lot more meaningful in that regard, and so that was really the main attraction from my perspective. But I'll let Carla talk about the district's perspective.
So I completely agree with Ruth on a lot of this, and I'm getting feedback now. Are you guys getting feedback on me? Okay, it's gotten better. Except from our perspective, especially mine as the assistant superintendent of research of a large urban district, there are so many questions that come to us specifically from our board, our superintendent, the other administrators overseeing departments, large federal grants, everybody wanting to have answers to questions right now, everybody wanting programs evaluated, everybody wanting information, and everyone looking to the research department to do that. But I also have a relatively small staff, though some people may think it's large. In order to answer all of those questions, it would need to be hugely larger than what it currently is. And so when this idea of having this partnership between Rice and HISD came about, I saw it as a great way to leverage the resources from both institutions. I have data, she's got people. What can we do to help answer the questions that meet the needs of the district and really improve the lives of our kids? And one of the things that happened with us is, instead of starting with a research topic, as Ruth said, we started with the structure and with the organization. And what were we going to do? And we created an MOU that basically said, here is what this partnership is about. And so there's kind of 4 prongs of it, and if I forget one, Ruth, help me. But one of them was on just creating a large data set. So I have a lot of data, but in a lot of very disparate places, and a lot of it is siloed, and we have years of data here and there and everywhere, but it wasn't in one large accessible data warehouse, because we didn't actually have one at the time. The district does now, but we didn't at the time we started the partnership. And so with Ruth's team, we were able to part of that arrangement was to create a longitudinal data set of a number of different metrics of kids from, we'd started with 10 years of data that would then allow us to answer questions. So you can't sometimes you start with the questions, sometimes you need to start with the data so that you can answer the questions. So one of the things was creating a data set. The other one was actually creating the partnership and coming up with what the research questions would be. And we agreed at the beginning that it should be focused on closing achievement gaps. So whatever we did, it should be focused on the district's needs, but also with the end goal of being a closing the achievement gaps. The third thing was to actually then build the capacity specifically of her team of undergraduate, graduate students of really knowing how to do applied research. But at the same time, I selfishly got my team included in that too, to be able to have professional development for my teams of researchers, because I don't have the opportunity that a university does of bringing in a lot of people and having professional development that is specific for researchers. There's a lot of professional development in the district for teachers, but there isn't professional development for the research staff. And so that's helping to build her team skills and my team skills. And Ruth, I forgot what the fourth one was.
I think it was assisting with data collection as needed, but we haven't really focused on that. That's probably why you forgot about it, because you have so much existing data that we haven't really focused on new data collection, that we have done a little bit of that. But yeah, just one last thing I would add to what Carla is saying, that in terms of actually developing the research agenda, it is jointly developed. Now that process has, to be perfectly honest, it's evolved over time, because we're sort of figuring this out as we go along. But I think that we're at a very good place. We, of course, still have plenty of room for improvement, but we are at a pretty good place right now in terms of that process of coming together to develop a research agenda that is of interest both to the academic researchers and also to the school district leadership. So I think that that's really a key element of the partnership.
And we have a number of things actually in the pipeline right now. So there are different research topics or research products that are always going on kind of simultaneously, but everything that we do after Ruth's team, my team, we come up with a collaborative research agenda, is then it's approved by our advisory board, and then once the advisory board approves it, then we allocate resources towards that.
It sounds like you guys have a lot going on and are quite successful. I'm also wondering, were there some differences that surfaced as you were figuring out this MOU, and things that you had to hash out that either you anticipated or maybe even were surprised about?
Yes. It's been a learning curve on both of our sides, but what's been awesome is that Ruth and I have both been in it from the beginning, and so we have continued to learn and grow together. And what started was, researchers, Ruth coming from a research perspective of wanting to do true research, and me coming from the district having a lot of input from my superintendent and others saying, we want things now, and we want, get HERC to do this evaluation and get HERC to do that evaluation, and then can you have it done in 2 months? And so trying to balance between what the district's needs are and trying to figure out, okay, what really should the research department focus on, and how can we really best leverage the HERC resources, and then also trying to get HERC's agenda and ideas able to then mesh with what it is that the district wanted. So it's taken some time to try to get to the point where I understand her demands and resources, and she understands my demands and needs, and trying to get them aligned. And over the last several years, I think we've done a really good job of that. But yeah, at first it was a little bumpy, but because we've always had a really good collegial relationship, we've been able to work out whatever the misalignments were to get us aligned together. So we've always worked well together, but just trying to get us all on the same page.
Mm-hmm. And
Dan.
can I add one thing? I'll keep it very brief, but from my perspective, I did not really know much of anything about how school districts work. At the start of this partnership, I thought I had an idea. I knew nothing about how districts work, and I've learned a lot through this partnership, and in particular from Carla. I mean, I still don't understand it as well as people who actually work in the districts do. But yes, that was the biggest cause for the bumpiness, was that I didn't know how districts work.
But you hung in there with each other together, and that sounds great. So Dan brings another district perspective from a curriculum standpoint as opposed to the research standpoint. How did you guys figure out navigating the bumps in the road and getting started on some joint work in Seattle and Renton?
Yeah, in some respects, a lot of similar ways to how Carla and Ruth are describing, in that it wasn't a traditional research question posed by the researcher with a strategy and then pitched to a school district to sign up on. And actually, we didn't even start in a really formalized way initially. What started was the opportunity that brought us together was in the school district, I had a need for resources to support transitions to the next generation science standards. And by resources, I mean professional development to increase kind of human resources, material resources in the form of curriculum. And so I successfully acquired or built a partnership with another school district and some other local agencies funded by a Washington State Math Science Partnership to use a curriculum adaptation strategy. And that is, it's professional development investment, but one of the outputs includes curricular resources as a result of that. This type of strategy I was really familiar with and had done similar work like this with Phil and his team in the Institute for Science and Math Education at UW. And really it was more of a sharing of we're professional pals, and so just kind of keeping each other informed on what we're up to. I think there was a pretty nominal, can you write a letter of support, and that's about it. But because then coincidentally his work, along with the Collaboratory, was focused on answering the question of how are teachers taking up these new practices, among other things. So it just provided a good opportunity for us to kind of informally, I'd say, welcome them in, because we already had a trusting relationship established from history. Also, because Phil's work, common research strategy they employ is a design-based research, so that includes both development work and research work. So it was just a pretty easy fit. No one had to contort into the other's frame. So that brought us together, and then over time, they became much more involved. Oh, and I'll say to note, so even in one detail, funding. The funding streams were parallel. They had their work and we had ours, but we continued to touch base and try to synchronize that, and it was a good kind of complementary approach. Fast forward through the years, and now in our second MSP, we're formal co-partners and actually share responsibilities on this single project. And so one of the things I want to highlight that I think is a great example of how we respond to each other's needs and then change our work. Previously, because I'd been in the district for now 5 years, kind of an older model of central office or some partner developing curricular resources, fairly scripted, send out to the schools, let's hold to fidelity of that implementation and everything will be just fine. Really tightly linked to here's mandatory training with that. I was really trying to break down this and kind of honor and validate there's a lot of really good work that happens in schools by teachers. And so it was really strange to me that a common question teachers would ask, say, wow, this experience is great, am I allowed to share these things with teachers back in my building? And it was just such a puzzling question. I'd say, of course. But it was common enough that I realized I had to be very explicit. We want this to be leaky. We want this to bleed to other teachers, but then not just cross our fingers and hope it happens, but actually design for that to happen. Our partners, Phil and his team, recognize, hey, this is a value of the science leadership in the district. How can the research and development actually support that leakiness, that spread? And so they pretty early on shifted to a social network analysis type of research, which was not in their wheelhouse. So this was not the hammer they had and every nail needed a social network analysis. This was something new that they picked up in response to their partners. So some pretty fabulous work came out of that.
So next-gen science standards capacity building, pretty big task for a district leader. And you haven't taken on everything. How did you decide what not to take on that maybe you started talking about and walking down a particular road?
Sure. Yeah, we were pretty careful at hopefully being strategic in that. So first of all, time frame. Technically, this started before the next generation science standards were released. The framework had been there, and I'm quite confident in saying both Phil's take, both from his participation in the framework and my read of the framework and participation.
Just to break, so we're talking about the framework for K-12 science education, which for those who don't know the next gen science standards, that's the document, the consensus volume by the NRC that informed the development of the standards.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and so that's really the public sort of policy document that existed at the time, and knew that did not want to just run over the whole ground of the next generation science standards. Next gen science standards have three dimensions: the disciplinary core ideas, science and engineering practices, and the cross-cutting concepts. First of all, we narrowed to, let's focus on the practices, in particular, a couple of core practices, or what we called core practices, constructing explanations and engaging in argument from evidence, and really focused on those. Here's an example where we did not tackle initially the disciplinary core ideas. In fact, we're very explicit to the teachers. So stick with the content you're used to teaching, even if it's the wrong content, whether it's off grade level or is not even in the new standards. Initially was, let's assume you know that well, or you know that as well as you know it. How do you engage in these couple of practices crossed with that particular content? Because that's a skill to construct learning performances that teachers needed to learn how to do regardless. The thinking was, rather than try to tackle new content, new practices in pedagogy, and new curricular materials all at once, let's focus on those practices in relation to some of the other more stable things and the materials and the content, and the other two will shift in response to that. So that was just a strategic decision, not to say that the others weren't important, it was just what do you start with? And in fact, by year 2, the teachers recognized that, wow, I need to learn new content, and I need to change the way I'm teaching. And so they were then driving the demand for the kind of next phases in the work. So it worked out really well.
So really thinking developmentally about this progression of how teachers were going to learn. Such an important idea for researchers too, who we like the whole vision and we want to see it all implemented at once. I'm going to turn back to Ananda and Jasmine, and I want to pick up on a thread of something that Dan mentioned about funding, because and this is in relationship to the question of how you meet your different partners' needs. And I know you guys have thought a lot about the funding structure as one of the ways that you make sure that the needs of partners are met. Can you say a little bit about how your partnership thinks about funding and between the different institutions?
You want me to start? Well, this was a really important question for us, in part because this was a collaborative project between a nonprofit organization, the American Indian Center of Chicago, a large research university, Northwestern, and the Menominee Language and Culture Commission. And equity was the central goal of the project, so funding obviously becomes important. And we were really concerned about all of the resources going to a large institution like Northwestern and having the responsibility of carrying the work out on the ground happening in community. So initially, the American Indian Center was awarded a subcontract through our National Science Foundation grants, and then we worked to make sure that the American Indian Center could directly receive NSF funding. But in addition to that, I think we also, and I think Megan Bang deserves a lot of credit here, was creative about how she structured the budget, and was attentive to, I guess one way to think about it is community content experts, right? That the expertise did not entirely lie in the university, and we were asking people to be generous with their time and ideas. And so one of the things she tried to do was to reciprocate in some way. But then she also, at that point in time, she was a researcher with Turk and the director of education at the American Indian Center, so she had these dual roles. And she worked to make sure that there was enough funding going through the American Indian Center that we could hire community researchers, so that researchers were not solely positioned at the university. So I feel like there were issues of equity in terms of who was being employed, but then also issues of equity around how the resources, financial resources, were being funneled.
That's helpful. Jean, I'm wondering if you might speak. I know that you all think really that valuing everybody's expertise is important in your partnership. It's a core principle of equity from your standpoint. Can you say how that works in the CTAN framework and in the context of the work that you guys are doing together?
Sure. Well, in terms of the actual day-to-day work, in terms of like collecting data and analyzing and stuff, we've tried to set up processes that involve both researchers and educators at the table. So as a researcher, I'll visit with Emily at a Techbridge after-school program, and I'll make observations, and and I'm very open about the process. I share my notes with the kids, with the teachers, but then I also write up the field notes and then give them directly to Emily and the teachers that I observed, and then we'll try to set up meetings as often as we can, which can be difficult because we all have so much on our plates, but we'll try to meet up and like look at specific excerpts or video together. Mm-hmm. And it's been great because there'll be moments where I thought I saw something one way, and then I'll hear like Ben say it from his perspective and what he heard, and I'll change my field notes based on what he shared, because I'll recognize where I might have seen things incorrectly because I don't know the context as well as he, Yeah. And then also, so we have some, excuse me, some shared analysis going on too.
Right, and so yeah, I think it's been really valuable in these meetings. I think all of the program coordinators I work with have always felt like we were able to bring that knowledge to the table, and you really listen to it, and also that we were able to sort of, do some of the driving of the questions or the way the conversation went. I know that one of our program coordinators, we talked sort of early on about failure in the maker movement, and he was concerned about how we frame that in our own work with the girls that we work with, and figuring out, that maybe it's not the right terminology to use. And I feel like that was part of the germs that sort of led to this paper that Jean wrote and that we were able to participate in a little bit in the writing of. And having those kinds of opportunities to work together on articles and presentations has been, I think, really valuable for us and our staff as well.
That's great. Carla and Ruth, how do you guys figure out how to make sure that both the district's needs and the researchers' needs are met in choosing your focuses of work?
Well, actually, I think the funding part of your question was really interesting, and I would like Ruth to address that, because in how she was able to get funding has allowed her to then meet the needs of the district, and I'll let her explain a little further.
Sure. So our funding has come through grant proposals that I wrote, and so that funding goes primarily through Rice University, but we do have a subcontract that goes to HISD in the sense that we pay for a member of Carla's staff, so that person is technically employed by the district, but that person is paid through HERC funds, and that position has turned out to be extremely important for the partnership, because at the beginning, if I may put it bluntly, we were a big burden to the research department at the district, because we were making huge data requests as we were setting up this longitudinal database that Carla mentioned earlier, and as she also mentioned, her department, relative to their workload, has a relatively small staff. And so as we acquired more funding, I don't know who came up with this idea. It was probably Carla's idea, but it was a good idea anyway, that to funnel some of that funding to the district to have a liaison that's paid by HERC, and that way we can bother that person all we want and not put an extra burden on the research department. And so that has really helped. But because most of the researchers are here at Rice, then most of that funding does come to Rice. But that's one exception, but a very important exception that has helped our partnership.
And I think having her having most of the money allows her to allocate the resources to then be able to answer the questions that are on the research agenda that we have jointly developed. So that is what meets the needs of the district, is having her team doing what it is that we have requested them to do. But having that additional person on my staff has really helped to keep the partnership going, keep the data going in the direction that it needed to, answer all of the questions, and then that position has also helped to do a lot of just the logistics of making sure that the research that's being done and the questions that are being asked over at HERC are being answered and is tying to what we need in the district, and helping to actually create liaisons between the researchers at HERC and the different departments in the district that are wanting research studies, such as our special ed department, our multilingual department, our career and college readiness department, our magnet schools department. So that way, that person on my team can help make sure that the district's needs are being met by the research that is being done by Ruth's team, and it's all being funded through those private grants that she's been able to get.
So I'm really hearing a nice common theme between you guys and the Living in Relationships groups about that careful thinking about both funding and the positions that funding pays for to really ensure the mutualism of the work. So really interesting. Dan, what are some ways that you all make sure that everybody's needs gets met through the partnership?
Yeah, there are a couple of ways. One, I'd say, is through our quarterly leadership meetings that have taken on a kind of a consistent structure. and 2 is we've been having more formalized bi-weekly research meetings. So first are the leadership team meetings. First of all, the membership has to have each institution represented, as opposed to a design team meeting where people's schedules are what they are. Not everyone needs to be at the table, but at our leadership team meetings, every institution has to be represented. And then 2 structures within that. One, it starts with, and we just kind of fell into these. We open with a whip around of basically what's going on in your organization. And what started as, oh, you don't want me to bother you with all the org changes I have, or yet another staff change. But actually, that stuff really matters for your partners. No, that's what you're going through. Second is because, as Phil labels the start with empathy to then lead to sympathies in a piece I'll mention later, we really are committed to each other, to where you might think you're just going to burden us and take up our time by sharing it, but no, actually, here in this partnership, we can help you with that problem. So it's just kind of this what's going on in your institution turns out to be really helpful. And then second, 3 questions, also kind of a whip around. Are your personal needs being met through the partnership? And are your institution's needs being met through the partnership? And are we meeting our partnership needs right now? And a lot of things emerge or can be prevented from festering, let's say, if your institution's needs aren't being met. So those are just a couple simple, but are simple structures. I didn't think they were that big of a deal. They just kind of seemed like something neat to do. Our external evaluator, though, who's been involved in multiple partnership projects, has said, no, those moves actually she feels are what have made a really big difference in our partnership compared to others. The other one is our research meetings, where this will be with me or the kind of school district lead, and then Phil's kind of a lead in Phil's team, who's helping to organize the different grad students. One thing is what we are and this is a more recent addition, one of our aims is to just make sure our interests are aligned and supported. So make sure the school district is at least aware of what's going on, that, yep, can help guide, well, we've got a broad number of directions we can go. How about we steer you this way would, I think, be more valuable to the district or the partnership. The other thing is being more aware to then help the researchers do their work, whether it's open doors or, oh wait, you're in that school? I didn't realize that. You need to stop right away and let me contact that principal first. This other school, you can just walk in and go straight to the classroom. This one, though, I know who that person is. It's a big deal that we follow certain patterns here. And then part of that, too, is not just a brokering. I want to point out that, back to the, again, Phil's empathy stance, personally, I try to approach that as through a mentoring type of a stance, that their organization, but also the grad students who don't realize, yeah, actually who you CC on that email turns out to be a really big deal in the school district. Little things like that, and then taking the time to explain to really, as kind of Ruth and Carla were talking about, you know, we come from just different cultures, different institutions, different norms, and so really just take the time to try to help the other side, if you will, understand more and more. And I'm not saying I do a great job at it, but I try to be a mentor, even though it's outside my scope of work, a mentor to staff on in the other organization.
It's such a good reminder, and I think all of these partnerships embody how much partnerships are about cultivating good relations. And it's about the work of human beings who come to care about and for one another and the work. So, and I think that's true here. And Dan, you're saying and making that really explicit how important that is to partnership work. I'm going to take and answer one of the questions that came from Laura Wentworth, one of our first guests for an RPP forum, who asks about local funders who fund these kind of hybrid roles of people. And Ruth has said, yes, local funders are a really good way to go because they're also often highly invested in both institutions, both the research institution and either the community organizations or school district. So definitely the local can be the way to go in these things. I'm going to switch gears because we're coming to the top of the hour. And I want to just remind folks, as part of each forum, we give our partnership guests a chance to share something that they're finding useful in their work. It could be a book they're reading, a tool they're using to help organize their work, anything that inspires them. And these resources are on the Research and Practice Collaboratory website at researchandpractice.org. So look for these resources as you hear our guests talk about them and links to those resources. So we'll start again with Ananda and Jasmine, and I'll hear about the resource that they've decided to share today.
The resource we decided to share today is a book by Indigenous scholar Joanne Archibald, Indigenous Story Work. And it's a book that we spent a lot of time with, and it helped us to reflect both on our design process as a form of collective story work, but also to think about the importance of stories, whether that's learning to hear stories, listen to stories, make stories, or tell stories. And also to think about story work as a method and what it means to make sense of narratives. So this is also connected to one of our big ideas in our projects, which is that everyone has a role to play. I don't know if you want to say anything about the resource?
Yeah, just like learning to listen to the different stories and the different perspectives and actually hearing them.
Great. Emily and Jean, what would you guys like to share today?
We had a couple of resources that are tinkering related, and then also a couple of resources that we've developed. So my team of program staff and I participated in the Exploratorium's Tinkering MOOC through Coursera over the summer, and we found that to be a really valuable professional development experience for them, and it was one that Jean observed as part of the work through the Tinkering Network. Although that course isn't running right now, they will run it again, and they also have a book called The Art of Tinkering, which I think is really inspirational for anyone who is interested in doing those kinds of tinkering and making activities. And then Jean, did you want to share ours?
Sure, yeah, and so Emily and I and others in the network have worked on 2 resources which we would actually love anyone to try out and give us feedback on so that we could make the resources better and see if they actually are useful beyond our group. One is called Building Equity into Research Practice Partnerships. Emily and I and Michelle Choi and others put our heads together to think about, like, well, what do we mean by an equitable partnership, first of all? And then what are some key things you can do to make sure equity is built into your partnerships? Key questions to visit and revisit as you build your partnership. So if people want to test those out, we love your feedback on that. And then the other resource we recently created is called the Value Mapping resource, which we shared earlier. So the resource that you can find on the Research Plus Practice Collaboratory website gives like a how-to do it, and then also some examples of how people have done it, not only in a research practice partnership context, but also as a professional development tool within an after-school program. So anyway, we'd love your thoughts on that, so thanks for the opportunity to share those.
Great, thanks. Carla and Ruth, what would you like to share?
So I'm going to go first because I want to tee up Ruth on this one. Bill, I loved your statement that said partnerships are all about cultivating good relationships, and that's really the best resource that I've had, and the one I've leaned on the most has actually been the resource of the relationships with other research partnerships. And we've had 2 collaboratives in the summer, or network meetings, and learning from the other partnerships of what they're doing and how they're doing it has just been completely invaluable to me. Now I'm going to tee it up to Ruth, who can talk about our national network that I think is so exciting.
Yeah, so I just sent a link to the network website. It's the National Education Research Practice Partnerships Network, and that is a brand new network that we launched, and we just hired a national director who will start in January, and the aim of this network is really to provide support for existing and developing research practice partnerships around the country, as well as host a national annual meeting where academic researchers and district leaders can come together and share with one another, share both best practices about partnerships and also share research findings and to potentially collaborate across partnerships nationwide. So I shared that link, as well as a link to a really useful website that is hosted by the William T. Grant Foundation. So I think both of those are worth sharing.
That's great. Thanks. And Dan, how about from your partnership? What would you like to share?
Sure. I'll just, because of time, briefly highlight a resource Phil shared, which is really a story that gives broader context for the work, and embedded in that are a couple of tools like the fishbone diagram, as well as a sample MOU that we developed, Memorandum of Understanding, and you can kind of see the back and forth to show even that was a negotiation. And then I'll just refer back those questions I said before to just keep as a standing set of questions in leadership meetings to just check in.
Great, thanks. So one thing I like to do is give folks a charge at the end of every forum about some things that you might be able to do in between now and the next forum, and encourage you to use Twitter to share when you've taken this action step, if you like. So take what you've learned today and brainstorm some different ways that you could approach a new partner and engage them in joint work. And if you work with schools, consider the strategies that you might be used, and if you're out of school, and how those might apply to you. So I'm actually thinking, if you work with schools, think about some of the things that you heard today from the community-based partnerships, a strategy that might work for you. And if you work in a community-based organization, what did you hear from these two district partnerships that might apply to you, especially when it comes to figuring out where you're going to focus joint work, how you're going to recognize the expertise of everybody in your partnership, and how you're going to maintain equity in that partnership. So I really encourage you to take that action step sometime in the next month and tell us about it on Twitter. You can also continue this conversation on Twitter using the hashtag RPPchat, and you can find all the resources mentioned today on the Research Practice Collaboratory website at researchandpractice.org. Research and Practice is all one word. And you can follow the Research Practice Collaboratory on Twitter at RPC or RP Collaboratory. And the Research Practice Collaboratory is funded by the National Science Foundation, and all the views here are the views of our panelists, but not our funder. I want you to join us next time on Thursday, December 17th, same time at 3 p.m. Mountain for our next forum. And the topic is going to be negotiating roles in partnerships. You can pose questions ahead of time for us on Twitter using the same hashtag RPPchat. We're going to be talking then to June Ahn and John Rice of the Blended Learning Partnership in Washington, D.C., Sue Allen from the Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education, and partner Allison Saunders of the Maine Mathematics and Science Alliance, Carrie Winger from the Seattle-Renton Partnership again, and Pam Buffington and Joe Louie from the RPP in Maine, called Investigating Interactive Technologies in Elementary Mathematics. And so that's it for this second RPP forum. I want to thank our guests for being here. It's been great to have you here. And here we are on the forum where we are researchers and educators working together for a better, more equitable education system for all our nation's young people. Thank you very much for attending today.